Welcome back. Now, South Africa's progressive anti-discrimination legislation on its own is not enough to help employees enforce their right to equal pay for equal work, with more than 80% of pay discrimination claims failing in the courts and close to 20 years of Employment Equity Act with this to bear. Now, this is according to Stellenbosch Business School's research chair, Professor Anita Bosch. And despite widespread equal pay legislation, women are still being paid less than men across all regions of the world. Professor Bosch joins us now for this discussion. Professor, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, as you say, Professor, we have enacted legislation to try and deal with this problem, this disparity, if you will. So why is it so difficult to enforce equal work for equal pay across the gender line?
Well, our study was really about discrimination in general, and of course, gender would be part of that. What we looked at are the cases, and there were only 26 cases between 1999 and 2020 that got to the labor courts based on pay discrimination. And we wanted to see whether our progressive legislation is aiding any individual to actually win their cases, to be successful in litigation. And it was interesting to see that only 3 cases out of the 26 that eventually got to labor court were successful.
So what seemed to be the problem in general or in the main, if you can be specific to that, Professor? And what would be the perfect scenario that would lead to more of these cases being won?
Well, we see that legislation in itself does not necessarily lead to equality, and that there are a number of mechanisms that employers and trade unions and the judiciary can put in place. The first thing is the CCMA is sort of a step usually before the labor courts, and there have been over 300 cases in the last year lodged in terms of pay discrimination or potential pay discrimination. The first thing is to educate yourself about the process of discrimination and to understand that difference is not necessarily discrimination. And I think most of the cases failed based on that. The other aspect was that you need a comparator, a person with whom you compare yourself. And often, because information is not available to the employee, they choose the wrong comparator, and therefore their cases fail. So information and the sharing of information, and therefore transparency about pay, is becoming essential before we really can move towards pay equality.
But in reality, though, Prof, we all know that there's huge secrecy, especially from HR departments when it comes to disclosing how much one earns. And how would you then go about knowing how much your male counterpart earns, as an example, where, you know, there are contractual curtains that are put in place in order to make sure that we don't know how much your colleague earns?
Yes, and there it is a very grey space, but what we suggest is firstly that you approach your HR department, and although they might not tell you exactly who earns what, they can give you an outline of roughly where you fit into the overall pay, the pay band. So that you can ask for and you can demand for that to be made available to you. And then in terms of relativity to other individuals, you can also ask for explanations as to why you are in a particular spot relative to other people in that band and what reasons are used for that. I think the mere fact that you start investigating also makes employers understand that we are better educated about our pay and where it falls, and therefore they also then start thinking about justifying differences more clearly. Other aspects would be, for instance, for trade unions to step in, to also ask and start demanding pay audits, because through a pay audit, we also see that differences are pointed out, and employers are then mandated actually through the Employment Equity Act to ensure that there is parity. There's also other ways for employees to actually share with each other. I can tell you what I earn, and you can tell me what you earn. We're just not allowed to tell other people about each other's salaries. And that is something that often employees find out about, these big discrepancies, by sharing in that type of way.
Professor, I'm not sure if you do have a few minutes for us, maybe 5 minutes. I just want to quickly hand over to Leanne for news and then just come back to this conversation. I just have a few more questions that I'd like to pose with regard to pay parity, and also the fact that it's not always just a discrepancy along gender lines, but sometimes across race as well. So how does one go about approaching that? How do you start, attending to the questions that need to be asked? Professor Anita Bosch is from the Stellenbosch Business School, and she's the research chair there. Prof, thanks so much for staying with us. Now, just getting back to the point that we were stopping at, which was about in the workplace itself, talking about HR departments, the secrecy around how much one earns, and not having to discuss that, or being allowed to discuss that with your colleagues, etc. And that sort of contractual curtain that is usually placed before us in the workplace. Where do you start in terms of questioning? You gave us some guidelines, but as I said, it's not always just a pay parity question along gender lines. Sometimes it's along racial lines as well.
Yes, and there are many grounds on which we can claim discrimination. There would, for instance, be even claims around disability and so forth. I think what is important for us to understand, because pay is a very emotive issue, as it should be. We give our labours to employers in exchange for money, our time, and our efforts. I think what is important is to understand that the law allows for differentiation, but does not allow for discrimination. And so differentiation might occur based on seniority level. It could occur based on skills or qualifications, and various other grounds that are indicated in the law as acceptable grounds for differences. But as soon as our human dignity is impaired, that is when discrimination is drawn on, and it would be differential treatment of a denigrating or prejudicial nature. And so, for instance, race or gender could fit into that. And so one has to be very mindful of thinking, then, if it is that you're comparing yourself to an employee that does, let's say, the same job as what you're doing, and the one employee is white and the other one black, and there's a difference in terms of pay, you do need to run through, or the same, the one is a man and the other is a woman, you do need to run through those grounds for difference and satisfy yourself that it is really not based on any of those grounds, or that the employer would be discriminating against you on even those grounds, and then put it forward and investigate with the employer.
But as you say, it's not an easy thing. And, from what you revealed earlier, even going through the legal process could be tenuous in itself. But your research also reveals that this is not uniquely South African. It's not something that's peculiar to us. It is widespread, even though this pay legislation exists. So Sunday, we know that it is the United Nations International a day of equal pay. So what is envisaged through the United Nations to try and address this particular matter?
Well, there has been many conventions. For instance, the International Labour Organization has had conventions for equal pay since the 1950s. And we have progressively improved, especially in terms of legislation. What our study has found, though, is that there are many mechanisms that are required outside of just the pure process for courts. A lot of education has to be done. on both the employer, the employee, the labor union side, and then also the role that pay experts can play. In other words, the remuneration experts that we often rely on, especially in large organizations, the role that they can play also to educate employees about job evaluations and how judgments are made about their pay. So there are many aspects to this, of which we feel in South Africa that the support to anybody that wants to make a pay discrimination claim has to be strengthened. The CCMA has done a lot of work in this regard, but definitely the route to the courts, a lot of support has to be given, similar to other discrimination and harassment cases, such as sexual harassment and so forth, that the Commission for Employment Equity has also reported on widely this year. If you want to make a case, you have to have support, and you have to be able to be trained in a way to understand exactly what the issues are that needs to be put forward. And we think definitely that labor unions can play a much stronger role in that regard.
Professor Bosch, thank you so much for your time. Stellenbosch Business School Research Chair for Women at Work, Professor Anita Bosch, speaking to us there about pay parity in the workplace, and talking to us about, some of the more nuanced aspects of how we can go about actually addressing these issues in the workplace. And as she said, you have every right to go and question, and the employer could then give you reasons for why discrepancies may exist, and you would then decide from there how you want to deal with that particular matter. And you could take it through the courts, because there is legislation that is in place to try and deal with this, to make sure that men and women, black and white, across the racial divide, are paid equally for equal work in the workplace.